Welcome to another episode of the Girls for Greatness podcast. As always, you guys, I so appreciate you listening in today. This is episode number 149. I am your host, Delia Perry, and you are in for a treat today with another real life, real talk episode with my good friend, Lauren. Lauren is another former guest on the show. She was a guest of mine on episode number 119, an episode entitled Examining the Value of Your Work. Highly recommend you guys go back and listen to that. But I wanted to give you guys just a little bit of a background on Lauren. And I know she's going to kind of dive in and talk a little bit more about what she's doing now and how she got to that point. But Lauren was actually an athlete herself. Her athletic career started at 5 when she swam her first race. Nearly 20 years later, she retired as team captain from a D1 swimming program. And that foundation as a successful student athlete set the tone for high achievement as an HR leader in the professional world. Though success and promotions kept coming her way, something was missing. So in November 2019, Lauren received her professional coaching certification from the Institute of Professional Excellence in Coaching, and she launched her own practice dedicated to leadership development and individual coaching. Despite quick success in that space, something was still missing. But just to let you guys know, she now specializes in working with current and former athletes and all ages and levels to master the mental part of the game. It's about mastering their minds to face their most challenging moments and reaching their full potential physically and mentally. Lauren's practice exists to show athletes they deserve an outlet to be heard, seen, and supported mentally and emotionally at the same level they are physically. Lauren leads with energy, grit, and unwavering commitment to what she set her mind on, and Lauren's spark is unique and infectious. She uses this distinctive combination to connect with athletes in a way that deepens their understanding and acceptance of exactly who they're meant to be to perform at their best every single time. You guys, I'm so excited for you guys to hear from Lauren. I'm excited to have her back on the show. So Lauren, welcome back to the show. Yay.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. And congrats on 149 episodes. That is impressive.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. That's so sweet. So I purposely, you guys, yes, I was reading her bio that she had sent me, as you probably could tell, but I left out some things in there because I wanted her to be able to share just kind of her story of how she's got to where she is. I know we're going to dive into some things that I think will really relate to everyone, not just specific to athletes, because even as I was looking through her website, I could tell that so much of that content is applicable to everyone. So Lauren, just tell us a little bit about you, where you're from, and then maybe a little bit about that backstory of how you got to this point now where you're working with athletes. You took your other coaching business and now you've totally revamped it, which is so awesome. I'm so glad we connected again so I can talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am also a native Ohioan. I live on the opposite side of the state in Cincinnati, and I grew up here. I swam here from the age of 5 until I graduated high school. And that's when I went into my college career. And as kind of the bio mentioned, as when I started my coaching practice, it was really focused on organizational leadership being kind of a natural progression from my HR career. But as I just kept in that space, it just didn't feel right. And, oftentimes we say that as humans, is like something is off, something just isn't clicking. And I couldn't figure that out. And it was about 18 months. And then it was about a week probably before the 2020 Olympics started. And as we all know, they were a year late. So it was August of 2021. And I had said to my business coach, there's just something about this thought of working with former athletes that really intrigues me. And at the time, it was more about the psychographic of athletes in terms of those, they're coached, they're used to being coached, right? They're willing to go all in, they're willing to give everything of themselves. And those are the characteristics that really energize me. And so fast forward to a week, and it was the night that Simone Biles removed herself from competition. And it was the night that Katie Ledecky won gold in the 1500 meter freestyle, but it was not a great race for her. She was probably about 20 seconds off her world record, if I remember. And I just remember watching her after she got out of the pool. She put on a mask immediately and put it up to her eyes and kept pushing it into her tear ducts so that you couldn't really see that she was upset and crying. and understandably so.
Mhm.
And when they were interviewing, when Michelle Tavoya was interviewing her after the race, she kept deflecting to the silver medalist, Erica Sullivan, who had a phenomenal race. And you could just tell that Katie was just trying to get it off of her. And then they cut to Michael Phelps, who, if anybody was watching, was at the Olympic Games. And he said something that just struck me in that moment of competing at this level is really overwhelming. We just want someone to talk to. We just want someone to listen, to allow us to be vulnerable, and who doesn't want to change us. And in that moment, I thought, oh my gosh, here is the most prolific Olympian that I'll probably ever see in my lifetime, sitting here telling the world at this level, we have basically no one. And it was that moment of thinking, I wonder what it would be like to work with former athletes, to that exact moment of, there's my calling. That's who I'm supposed to serve in this world, is athletes. And so that's how the practice came to be, of working with both current and even retiring athletes. Because I had this epiphany moment that we can talk about too, of to optimize their mental game to the same level that they work on their physical game. Because more and more athletes are raising their hands and saying, hey guys, I know I seem superhuman on the physical side, but mentally I still struggle like everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really great point. That's awesome. Yeah, I remember those moments. I watched those same moments. I think I missed the interview with Phelps, but I did remember seeing Ledecky with that. And of course, Simone Biles, that was all over the news. And that's amazing that you kind of just had that realization, even from your own, time as an athlete and just what you experienced. I'm curious for you, what was that time for you like? I mean, could you relate? I mean, obviously you're not at that level, but still, I mean, Division I, I mean, I was an athlete too, not a Division I athlete, but I mean, there's a lot that goes into being a collegiate athlete, and there's a lot to juggle. And I'm just curious, like for you, what your experience was and how that's kind of maybe even just inspired you to get to where you're at now with working with others.
Yeah. And that's a great question, because it kind of, that moment took me back to my own experiences. And at that moment too, I thought to myself, okay, well, if the highest level athletes are saying this, it's got to exist at all other levels as well. And so it took me back to my own experience. And I will always say that I had a successful career. To be able to do something for almost 20 years and not really be burnt out on it, to me in and of itself is a success, right? Regardless of what I actually achieved inside the sport. But what it brought me back to was that what I really struggled with as an athlete was getting out of my own head. I was my coaches, I had probably 50 coaches over my entire lifetime, which is a lot, right? You sit back and think like, oh my goodness, I was coached by 50 people.
Yeah.
But kind of the resounding theme was I was emotional. And by that, my coaches knew I cared so much. And that was almost working against me. It worked against me more than it worked for me, in terms of I cared so much. I was so focused on very specific outcomes and always being quote unquote perfect every time I swam, even if it was not a very important meet, right? I mean, every athlete has a competition that is,
right.
How do I say not important? You're just kind of going through the motion. It's just part of the season, right? And that was my biggest struggle. And it took me back to the last meet I ever swam, which was my senior year in college. Worst meet ever, literally worst meet I've ever swam in my life. And now that I've been 20 years removed nearly, I had this aha moment as all of this came together of, that was my biggest challenge, is that meet specifically, I hadn't planned for the emotion of my career coming to an end. And again, that was an inspiration of then working with transitioning athletes, because of that moment of, you get to the top, you get to the pinnacle, and literally within minutes, it's over.
Right.
And you're left there with, well, what do I do now? And you may not think about that in the moment, but it comes up. And that for me is when, I struggled mentally as an athlete. And then I didn't necessarily realize at the time I was struggling pretty significantly making the transition from my athletic life to my non-athletic life.
Sure. Yeah, that is a big transition. I mean, I remember the same. I mean, it's kind of a whirlwind of what do I do now? And who am I now? Because I mean, at least I felt like that. I ended in my season ended in the fall with volleyball. And then I actually went overseas for my second semester, my last semester of college, because I was studying Spanish. So I went to Madrid. And I think those two things of like finding my identity there and then, having that career come to a halt and then even coming back to the States. And I remember the following fall, um, feeling much the same way, like lost almost. Like it was a big transition. And because you pour so much time, so much energy, so much focus into this one thing that, even if your season is only a few months, you're basically focused on it for the majority of the year, I mean, very little time off. So that's a lot. And I feel like that carries over to just almost sometimes with transitions in life. Like you've seen it with your own career, moving from HR to the coaching career you had to now a totally different coaching approach. So um, I think there's a big carryover with that. I mean, how has that been for you? I mean, have you seen those same types of things where you're like, okay, I got to figure this out and my identity is different now and you know what I mean? The whole
Yeah.
transitions.
You know, what's really funny about this entire experience is that when I had this aha moment of athletes are who I serve, I can't necessarily discern whether it was intentional or not, but
Mm-hmm.
I went back into my athletic story and I pulled so much more from it than I had when it actually happened. And I recognized there was a very unintentional transition from my athletic life to my non-athletic life. I much like most athletes out there, you're just conditioned, okay, like one thing is over, then you move on to the next, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we give very
Mm-hmm.
little thought to what it means, how it affects us, and as you're saying, my
Right.
identity. And so as I was rooting through my previous experiences, I recognized, oh my gosh, it was completely unintentional. And it was this light bulb moment for me that as I was transitioning in my now fast forward to where I am now and transitioning my business to be very intentional about it, of saying, okay, what is it that I want to be in this space? Or who do I want to
Mm.
be in this space? And I took a lot of what I never noticed 20 years ago and put it into now. And I'll give you a specific example with
Mm.
my last year in college. I say at the time, I said I was really burnt out my senior year. But now that I reflect back on it, I wasn't burnt out at all. What I recognize is that from the start of that year until it ended, I was mourning this loss of my identity, but not being conscious that I thought it
Mm.
was my identity.
Mm.
And I went over all these experiences that I had when I was a senior in terms of I got in a fight with my coach fairly consistently. I had some run-ins with my own teammates. My times
Mm.
were really off that year. And again, I wanted it so badly because it was my last year of like, this is my last hurrah. I have nothing else after this. That I had actually worked against myself and was completely unconscious that I was so incredibly sad to leave this life that I loved.
Mm.
And so as I rooted through that and really started making sense of what that actually meant to me, I transitioned that into this transition now of, okay, back then you didn't think about who you wanted to be or how you wanted to
Mhm.
show up as a professional. And so I took a lot of time, not only with my own coach, my business coach, but I worked with
Mm.
somebody who specializes in imaging and personal branding.
Mm.
And I was very intentional about that because I said to myself, I want this experience to be different. I want to learn from the experience that I
Mm.
had, and I was completely unintentional about it. How now do I be very intentional? And so working with those two people really put me on a path of this is who I am, and this is what I'm going to focus on in terms of current athletes. And I had originally started
Mm.
with D1, semi-pro, and professional. But now as I'm getting into it, I'm recognizing and listening to the market that even those at high school and the younger levels are seeking this kind of support. and then to be very intentional with transitioning athletes.
Yeah.
And so that's really where my focus started. So it was being able to take that experience and transition it to now.
That's so true. That's so true. I think so many of the traits too that you described about yourself, like being the perfectionist or wanting to, you're so driven and you want to do things right every time. And I was much the same way. And now it's funny just hearing you say that. I mean, I just realized like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, like my son has the same mentality and he probably takes after, takes after me more than anyone, but he's the same way. I mean, so incredibly hard on himself, like almost like I always talk about on here being your own worst enemy. It's like he cares so much about doing well and doing well for his team and all of those things that, a lot of times I feel like that mental stress is what takes over and inhibits, I see that. I saw that in myself at times, and I think we can see it in ourselves sometimes in life, just expecting so much and then letting that almost deter us from moving forward.
Yeah. I see it in my son as well.
Yeah.
And I'm really conscious of it. And, at the very beginning, I was trying to, before I really focused on athletes, I was trying to get him to realize like, hey, buddy, 10 years from now, you're not going to remember. It's not going to matter.
Right.
But then I thought to myself, well, what if someone had said that to me when I was 10, 11 years old, as my son is? And I thought, I wouldn't be able to hear that because it's everything to me right now.
Right.
And so I started to shift, even with him, before I got into the space of, really working with him to say, every moment that you face in athletics, but you can translate this to life too, is independent in and of itself in that moment, right? Everything that happened to you, let's use a game, right? Every play that you played up until you get to this moment has no bearing on what's going to happen unless you choose to, or unless you get into the mindset that, oh my gosh, my performance is already derailed because I've done X, Y, and Z. And so therefore I can't make the shot moving forward. Or, he plays football, basketball, baseball, right? I mean, all these sports that have immediate plays right after one another. And so what we started working on is take a pause, right? So that play is over.
Right.
Ask yourself, now that this is behind me, how do I show up the best that I can right now for this play?
Right.
And so getting him to think about, okay, they're all independent of one another, but when you're done with that game or that match or that race or whatever the case may be, taking time to root through kind of what was going on for him in each of those moments so he can learn from that.
Right.
And that's what I work on with a lot of athletes too, is to get them in a space of, it is really important. I'm not going to downplay that, right? Kind of getting my own mindset, right?
Right.
We're not going to downplay it because it is really important to you. Okay, so how do we then approach each competition as if every single action is independent of one another, so you can find space, room, air to think through or to feel your way through this next step in the competition. And they found that that's been really helpful. It kind of gets each athlete to compartmentalize each part of the competition versus, oh my gosh, I've got this big behemoth in front of me and I've got to be perfect every step of the way.
Time. Yeah. It's so true. That's, I love that approach too. I'll definitely take that one, that suggestion and use that. No, that's great. One thing I noticed on your site that I loved was, your tagline or quote that says, performance reimagined boldly, go where you've already been. Tell me about that, how you came up with that.
Yeah. So I was actually working with a branding specialist, somebody I was working very intentionally to kind of get this. And as we were talking through it, he said, as I was going through stuff, he said, the two words that keep coming up for me are performance reimagined. And when he said it to me, I got tears in my eyes because it was the culmination of what I'm trying to portray, is that, because and I don't want to make generalizations, but let's say most athletes come to the table of like, I want to be perfect. I want to win, right? I mean, what athlete trains to lose, right?
Right.
But it's this concept of maybe everything that you've worked for up until now, or what you thought needs to be perfection. How do we reimagine that? How do we think about your performance in a different way?
Mm.
And the tagline of boldly go where you've already been is that most athletes in a situation where the outcome doesn't matter knows how to perform and just let go in order to optimize their performance in that moment. So a specific example is, ask any athlete one, their best performance, and they'll say something to the effect of, I kind of don't remember what happened, or I don't know that I was really thinking about anything. I just did, right? So this concept of, how to optimize your performance. It's a matter of recognizing those steps you've taken, sometimes unconsciously, to get there.
Right.
How do you go back to that space and reimagine performance in a different way? Another example is, a lot of athletes are great practice athletes. You'll hear athletes say, oh my God, I loved practice, was my favorite. I mean, it was just the playground to do whatever I could possibly think of to see how capable I am. And again, it goes back to boldly go where you've already been. You know how to do it. It's a matter of letting go of the expectation of perfection, or a certain time, or a certain place, or running a play in a very specific way, and allowing your body to take over in your instincts because you've practiced it, because you've been there, and being able to recreate that environment for yourself, devoid of a very specific outcome, which is very hard for athletes. I'm not going to discount that, but that's where all of that came from.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I can definitely relate to that. Even, I mean, I think so much of what you're saying, I mean, I obviously relate to in terms of athletics, but I feel like, for those listening and who may not have that background, I feel is still so applicable to just life, and understanding that, obviously we can't do everything perfectly. And that, I think the practice, when I think of life, is how we live each day, and our daily practices, our habits, and all of those things. And I think those all play a point, or a big part in, getting us to wherever we want to be at, and to becoming better. And I mean, I feel like it's not just always this end point that we get to, that's the pinnacle. It's the whole journey, and the part of it too is enjoying that journey. And I know, relating it back to athletics, like I definitely, enjoyed that journey, and I too was a lover of practice. But I also had to reach a point where I just tried to play for the joy and love of the game and the people that I was around, and really trying to hone in on that. And I think that's when my team played the best, was when we were truly just like in the moment, and weren't looking at it as this high pressure, high stake situation. And that's a hard thing to do, for sure. But I feel like even in life, I mean, we miss that. We get so hyper focused on the outcome, or what we're shooting for, and all of the rest, just, it's not fun anymore. And it's a struggle. And so that's where I think the carryover is. At least that's kind of how I see it. I don't know about you.
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head. And again, what I work on with athletes is no different than, quite honestly, any coach works on with any other demographic. It is a matter of reaching this, almost what I like to call experience orientation versus performance orientation. And by that, I mean exactly what you just described, of the joy and the thrill and the fun of it versus the win, or heaven forbid, loss of it all. And because when we're so focused on that outcome, that's when things like judgment and resentment and anger kind of flood in, because we're so focused on a black or white kind of outcome versus a more fluid approach to, I can't control everything that's going to happen in this competition before, during, or after. And how do I relieve myself of the pressure by really focusing on the experiences I have through it and what I'm going to learn from it versus the, oh my God, I have to win. Or if I lose, I'm going to be so incredibly angry, or,
Yeah, that's true.
But that orientation makes sense though, because particularly with it makes sense for anybody, but coming back to athletics is because you work and you're so focused for so long on one particular event or game or race or, whatever,
Yeah.
it makes sense to get into that black and white, versus trying to be a little bit more open to the gray. And I would even say it's even more difficult now than it was when we were growing up, because we didn't have access to
media.
Someone having an opinion or something to say at a moment's notice and can blast it for millions of people to see. And I think that too has made it more challenging to be open to the fun, the joy, the processing, the experience of it versus the award behind it.
Right. You're absolutely right. And I think that's true for, anyone too listening that obviously spends any time on media. That whole part of life, yes, I think it serves a purpose. And I've talked a lot about this on here. I'm not going to beat a dead horse, so to speak, but I think you have to be very guarded as to what you're letting yourself consume if you really want to move yourself forward in any given area. I mean, I've had to self-examine for myself and how I spent my time and, the people I want to follow, the people, it's very easy, as we all know, to get sucked down that hole of comparison in a matter of minutes. I mean, it was just happening to me the other day. I had like idle time and I looked at the clock and I was like, oh my gosh, did I just spend 25 minutes looking at a profile that, why?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it's in our nature. It's what we've been conditioned with, but it's also about, really honing in on what you want and not letting yourself become derailed by all of the noise that's out there. So that's not easy.
Yeah.
How do you think we start to kind of reach our full potential and become our best as human beings? I mean, I know you obviously work with that idea in the athletic world and with former athletes, but as a whole, I'm curious what your thoughts would be on that.
Yeah. I think the first step in reaching our full potential is really knowing exactly who we are. By that, I mean, it's really building the self-awareness. I think the three biggest things for us as humans to really understand, to start down that path, are what are our motivations, right? What is it that gets us out of bed? What is it that brings us energy, that lights us on fire, that pushes us forward, that makes it easy for us to want to continue pushing forward? Then on the flip side, what are our triggers? I know that's a hot button word, but what is it that derails us? Like, what are those instances that get under our skin? And most importantly, why? And again, relating back to athletics is you can get caught in the me versus them mentality easily, because that's what the whole world is designed to do, right? I mean, the world is designed to have a winner and a loser, right? But when we understand the motivations and our triggers, we can start to get a better sense of why we react to things a certain way, so that we can start responding. And I'm sure our listeners or your listeners know kind of the difference between a reaction and a response. A reaction is that unconscious reaction to a situation, whereas the response tends to be a little bit more thoughtful and conscious. And so it's it's allowing ourselves the time, effort, and energy to understand what are those two things about us so that we can actually go from an unconscious reaction to a much more conscious and intentional response.
Mm.
And then the third thing is really knowing your values and really taking time to understand what it is that's really important to me so that we can start, or so that you as an athlete or you as a human in any capacity can really start to understand how to really design your life in a way that allows you to shine your brightest. And when you're not, why? So what happens is oftentimes when we're anxious or angry or frustrated or resentful, it's that somewhere our values are being challenged. And oftentimes our values are created unconsciously, whether they're created by our parents, by our friends, by our school, by our sports team, whatever the case may be. And we kind of all like bring them together, but often without thought. And it's not until you kind of stop and say, okay, something happens to you and you're feeling anger. Okay, why am I feeling angry? And then if you start to undo those layers, it's like, oh, well, my value of communication is being challenged because it's not happening right now. That's just an example. But I think those three things are the pinnacle for all of us to understand so that we can start to really move towards that our fullest potential. And goodness, I was going to say something, I lost my train of thought. But I think those three things are paramount. And if there is no other self-work that is completed, if those three things are done, then you're well on your way to reaching your potential more so than you would if you didn't touch them at all.
Yeah, that's so true. I love those, Lauren. I love those. So Lauren, one other question I have before I kind of dive into wrapping things up was this whole concept of getting out of your own head, which I think obviously is important to athletes. I mean, it's such a huge thing, but I think in terms of just everyone getting out of their own head, I mean, we hear that phrase sometimes, get out of your own head, move forward. I mean, I'm just curious for you, how you approach that and what your advice is, for others that are kind of feel like they're kind of stuck in that space of just almost like feeling paralyzed because of their own thoughts.
Yeah. Well, that phrase is kind of the inspiration behind this too, is that I would often be told that by my coaches. It was just get over it, just get out of your own head. And it was kind of like, okay, well, I see the value in that. I just don't know how.
Right.
And that goes back to it really starts with the three things I mentioned in order to reach your full potential in terms of understanding what motivates you, understanding what gets under your skin, and understanding your values. Because knowing those foundational points gives you something to come back to, something to reference, so that when you are spiraling out of control, as we all are capable of doing with our thoughts, to take a pause and say to yourself, what has me spinning out of control right now? And if you go back to your trigger points, have I experienced one of those? Am I interpreting something from someone else that I perceive to be a trigger? Is this real to me right now? And yes, it is real to you, but being able to find a moment to say, okay, what about it? It right here, right now is paralyzing me, or is getting me to a space of being angry. How do I unravel that? But also going back to your values. One of the things that I've come to learn and that I work on with athletes is that when you feel anxiety is an indication that something is out of alignment. And it could be, it could be any number of things, but oftentimes the deepest level of misalignment is when our values are either not present in a situation, or they're being challenged, or we're perceiving that they're being challenged. Because oftentimes, how many people can say they know their values, but how many people can say, oh, that other person knows my values?
Right.
And so knowing those three things, that when you're feeling overwhelmed or stuck or paralyzed, going back to them to give you a reference point to start to come out of it. And that's what I really work on with athletes too, of particularly in those moments when you're standing in front of the biggest competition of your life and you're starting to freak out. Okay, what are you truly freaking out about? Because it is very real and it's worth exploring.
Right.
But you've got to find a reference point to start.
That's so cool. I love that. That's great. A great point. Well, I know on my other episode that you were on, I obviously had some questions that I kind of wrapped up with, but one that I know I did not use, I don't believe at that time, that I'm using this season is just asking the question of how you personally embody greatness and how you just kind of bring that into your own life.
Yeah. God, that's a great question. Well, it being the start of a new year, my word for the year was growth. I always set a word for the year, grow or growth. And that is my word for this year. And I don't necessarily like to set goals. And I know as a former athlete and coach who works with athletes, that's counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But what I've also learned is that when I'm so beholden to that one thing, I cut myself off from growing or seeing something different. And one of the practices that I've gotten used to this year for the first week, I'm going fairly strong, is the concept of journaling. And what I found is by taking maybe 20, 30 minutes at the end of every day to root through what came up for me that day or the dominant thoughts for that day, to get them out on paper and to get them up and out of my mind to help to either release them if they're keeping me back or to root through them if they're very empowering. And one thing that I've actually found naturally that's happened is my journaling practice is at the end, I'll have this stream of conscious aha moment. And somehow I've ended up asking myself really powerful questions. And an example from this last week was, how am I standing in my own way of my peak performance? And it was this situation, dealing with it. I was really holding myself back. And this concept that we as humans are actually wired for pessimism. And this concept of, we'd never want to go too big because deep down inside, we don't necessarily feel worthy enough to actually accomplish it. And so I was rooting through that topic for myself. And it was, well, how am I standing my own way of going bigger in my peak performance? And so this journaling practice has really been how I exemplify my greatness, because it gets me to take a pause, to unravel, and then to figure out, okay, how do I move forward having experienced what I just did?
Love that. Love that. It's a great practice. That's a great practice.
Huge these last 7 days.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I have to adopt that myself. That's great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I've so loved this topic of conversation. I think it's going to, empower so many that are listening, especially with, like you said, the start of the new year and just thinking about some of those things that you've touched on. So I really, really appreciate you taking the time. It's been so fun to connect again, and can't wait to see what happens with this new approach with what you're doing, because I think it's really unique and so needed on so many levels. So that's awesome.
Yes. Well, thank you for having me again. I appreciate it. And, being open to having made a complete pivot in my business.
No, I love it.
To exploring that. Thank you.